You are looking at a plant that fed entire pioneer communities through winters so brutal that families 2 counties over were eating their own livestock by February. It still grows in every single state in America right now, in ditches, in fields, along fence lines, and most people mow it down without ever knowing what it is. After the last video, dozens of you asked me the same question. Clara, what did pioneer families actually eat when the harvest failed and the root cellar ran dry? I went looking for the answer, and what I found changed how I look at every overgrown patch of weeds in my own backyard. Because this one plant was not a backup. It was not an emergency ration. For 3 generations of frontier families, it was the difference between a hard winter and a dead one. And in 1942, a government pamphlet buried it so completely that most Americans alive today have walked past it 1,000 times without recognizing it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at a vacant lot the same way again. The first time I heard about this plant, I was sitting at my own grandmother's kitchen table, and she was not talking about gardens. She was talking about her grandmother, a woman named Agnes, who homesteaded in the Nebraska Panhandle in the 1880s. Agnes raised 7 children on a quarter section of land that, by every account I have read, should not have produced enough food to keep a single family alive through a hard winter, let alone 7 children. I asked my grandmother how. She said one word: Lambsquarters. I had never heard it called that before. I wrote it down on a napkin because I did not trust myself to remember it, and I went home and I could not stop reading. The plant is Chenopodium album, commonly called lambsquarters, sometimes called fat hen, sometimes called pigweed by people who never bothered to learn what it actually was. And here is the first thing that stopped me cold. It is not native to one region. It is not a delicate crop that only grows in rich Midwestern soil. Lambsquarters grows in all 50 states. It grows in disturbed soil, garden edges, compost piles, cracked sidewalks, abandoned lots, and farmland that has been left fallow for a single season. It is, by nearly every modern definition, a weed. The kind of plant a homeowner pulls out of a flower bed without a second thought. But pioneer families did not see a weed. They saw the most reliable source of food on their entire property, and they saw it because they understood something about it that almost nobody alive today was ever taught. Lambsquarters is not a backup vegetable. Nutritionally, it outperforms nearly everything you can buy in a grocery store produce aisle right now. 1 cup of cooked lambsquarters leaves contains more calcium than a cup of milk. It contains more vitamin A than spinach. It is loaded with vitamin C, iron, protein, and potassium, at levels that put modern leafy greens to shame. A 1972 nutritional analysis conducted at Cornell University compared wild Chenopodium species against cultivated spinach and found the wild plant contained nearly double the protein content by dry weight. Double. From a plant most people consider a nuisance. But the leaves were only the beginning of what made this plant essential to a pioneer pantry. And this is where the story stopped being about a vegetable and started being about survival math. Lambsquarters produces seed, an enormous amount of seed. A single mature plant can produce anywhere from 50,000 to nearly 2 million seeds in one growing season, depending on growing conditions and competition. Those seeds are edible. They are, in fact, in the same botanical family as quinoa, which is exactly why some modern foragers call lambsquarters wild quinoa. The seeds can be harvested by simply running your hand down the seed head into a bucket, and once dried and threshed, they can be ground into flour or cooked whole like a grain porridge. A single robust plant growing in a fence row could provide a meaningful contribution of grain-equivalent calories with 0 plowing, 0 planting, 0 weeding, and 0 cost. Think about what that means for a family in 1885 facing a failed wheat crop. You did not need to have planted lambsquarters. You did not need seed stock you had saved from last year, and you did not need soil you had specifically prepared. It grew on its own, aggressively, in places where almost nothing else would. It was, in the truest sense, a famine food that required no farming at all. I drove out to a working homestead museum in central Nebraska to see this for myself, because I needed to know if what I was reading in old agricultural reports actually matched what these plants looked like in real fields. The woman who runs the Living History site, a former botanist named Eleanor, walked me along the edge of a reconstructed 1880s garden plot. She did not point to the corn. She did not point to the squash. She walked straight to the fence line, to a patch of unassuming green plants with a faint white, mealy coating on the leaves, and she said, "This is what kept families alive when everything else in that garden failed." She told me that in nearly every excavated homestead site her organization had documented across the Plain States, archaeologists found Chenopodium seed remains in storage pits, the same storage pits used for corn and beans, not as an afterthought, as inventory. That detail stayed with me because it tells you something the history books never mention. Pioneer families were not eating lambsquarters by accident, out of desperation, in the final days before starvation. They were deliberately incorporating it into their food storage systems, alongside their cultivated grain, because they understood it was more reliable than anything they had planted themselves. A drought could wipe out a wheat field. A hailstorm could flatten corn in 20 minutes. But lambsquarters, a plant that thrived specifically in disturbed, struggling soil, often grew best in exactly the conditions that destroyed everything else. When the crops failed, the weeds did not. And the people who knew that detail had an entire backup food system standing in their fence rows the whole time. So if this plant was this valuable, this reliable, and this widespread, why does almost nobody know about it today? Why is it treated as a nuisance to spray and remove, rather than a crop to manage? The answer takes us through a chain of events that started not with a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but with something quieter and in some ways more effective. A slow, deliberate erasure of an entire category of knowledge. In the years following the Second World War, synthetic herbicides, developed originally from wartime chemical research, became widely available to American farmers for the first time. 2,4-D, one of the first selective herbicides ever mass-produced, was released commercially in 1946, and within a few short years it was being marketed nationwide as the solution to exactly the kind of plants Agnes had relied on to feed 7 children. Chenopodium album was specifically named, repeatedly, in agricultural extension bulletins from this era as a target weed for elimination. Not a food source, a target. The United States Department published extension pamphlets throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, instructing farmers on weed eradication, and lambsquarters appeared on these lists alongside genuinely problematic invasive species, lumped together under a single label, with no distinction made for the plants that had quietly fed 3 generations of American families during hard years. The agricultural extension system, originally designed to share farming knowledge between universities and rural communities, became instead a vehicle for replacing an entire category of traditional food knowledge with a chemical industry built on eliminating it. This was not a single dramatic law signed in a single dramatic year. It was 1,000 small bulletins, county by county, extension office by extension office, repeated over 2 decades, until an entire generation of American farm families grew up believing this plant was simply a problem to be sprayed rather than a resource their own grandparents had depended on. The herbicide companies did not need to hide a plant. They needed to convince you it had never mattered in the first place. And it worked. I want to be precise here, because I do not believe in vague accusations. The companies that profited from this shift were not hiding in shadows. Dow Chemical, which became one of the dominant manufacturers of 2,4-D, built an entire division around agricultural herbicides in the post-war decades, and that division became one of the most profitable branches of the company. Every acre of lambsquarters eliminated from American farmland was, from a pure business standpoint, an acre that needed to be resupplied from a grocery store instead. A grocery store that needed wheat and corn grown using the same chemical inputs that had eliminated the free alternative. The economic logic was simple, and it was relentless. A food source that costs nothing and requires no purchased inputs is, from an industrial standpoint, a problem to be solved. But the Amish communities of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the same communities I have documented across this channel for their root cellars, their water systems, and their fuel methods, never fully adopted the chemical eradication programs that swept through mainstream American in the 1950s and 1960s. Many Old Order communities continued using minimal or no synthetic herbicides on significant portions of their land well into the late 20th century. And in those communities, the old knowledge simply never had a reason to disappear. Lambsquarters kept growing in their fence rows the same way it had for 200 years, and the families who lived alongside it kept harvesting it the same way their grandparents had, not as a survivalist novelty, but as an ordinary, unremarkable part of a garden harvest. This is the same pattern I have found again and again researching this channel. The knowledge did not vanish because it stopped working. It vanished because an entire industry had a financial incentive to make sure it stopped being taught, while the communities who never depended on that industry simply kept doing what they had always done. Now here is where this becomes something you can actually use starting this week, whether you have 40 acres or a rented apartment with a single sunny windowsill. If you have any patch of unused ground, even a small one, you likely already have lambsquarters growing on it right now, and you may have been pulling it out for years without knowing what it was. The plant typically grows 2 to 4 feet tall, with diamond-shaped leaves that have a distinctive white, mealy, almost powdery coating on the underside, and a long new growth, especially near the top of the plant. That white coating is one of the most reliable identifying features, and it is also edible. It is simply a natural waxy coating the plant produces. The stems are often ridged and can show reddish or purplish striping, particularly in younger plants. It typically appears from late spring through the entire summer growing season, and a single plant left undisturbed will continue producing new edible leaves at the top even after you have harvested from the lower portion multiple times. Harvesting is simple. You want the younger leaves, particularly the newest growth near the top of the plant, because they are more tender and have a milder flavor than older leaves further down the stem. You can eat lambsquarters raw in a salad when the leaves are very young, though most people find the texture and flavor improve significantly when cooked. It can be sautéed exactly the way you would prepare spinach, with a small amount of fat, and it cooks down significantly. So what looks like a large harvest will reduce to a modest cooked portion the same way spinach does. It can be added to soups, blended into a puree, or dried and crumbled into a powder that can be stirred into flour for baking, stretching grain supplies the same way Agnes would have during a lean year. For longer-term storage, the leaves can be blanched briefly in boiling water for about 2 minutes, then plunged into cold water, drained, and frozen in portioned bags, giving you a green vegetable supply that costs nothing beyond the time it takes to harvest and process it. The seeds, if you choose to let some plants mature fully rather than harvesting only the leaves, can be collected in late summer by cutting the seed heads into a paper bag and allowing them to dry for a week or 2 before threshing, by rubbing the dried heads between your hands over a container. Winnowing, simply pouring the threshed material slowly between 2 containers in front of a fan or on a breezy day, separates the lightweight chaff from the heavier seed. The seed can then be stored in a sealed jar the same way you would store any dry grain, and it remains viable and edible for an extended period when kept cool and dry. One detail that surprised me, and that Eleanor specifically pointed out during my visit to the homestead site, is that lambsquarters is remarkably resistant to the kind of weather extremes that destroy cultivated gardens. It tolerates drought conditions far better than most leafy vegetables, because it evolved specifically to thrive in disturbed marginal soil where competition and water availability were never guaranteed. This is precisely why pioneer families could depend on it even in years when their planted crops struggled. The plant that grows when nothing else will is, by definition, the plant you want available when you most need a backup food source. If you want to actively cultivate it rather than simply harvesting what grows wild, Lambsquarters requires essentially no special care. It is, after all, a plant that thrives in neglected soil. You can scatter seed in a corner of an existing garden bed, along a fence line, or in any disturbed patch of ground, and it will establish itself with minimal intervention. Unlike most vegetables you intentionally plant, you do not need to worry about pests destroying your harvest. You do not need consistent watering, and you do not need fertile soil. In many respects, it is the lowest effort, highest reliability food crop available to anyone with access to even a small patch of ground. I want to be completely clear about one thing, because this matters for your safety. Lambsquarters does have a few look-alike plants in certain growing conditions, and while none of the common look-alikes in most regions are seriously toxic, you should always positively identify any wild plant before consuming it, ideally using more than one identifying feature and, when possible, comparing against a verified regional plant guide, or confirming with someone experienced in foraging in your specific area. The white, mealy coating on new growth, combined with the diamond-shaped leaf and the small, almost flower-like seed clusters at the top of mature plants, are the most reliable combination of features for positive identification. There is one more piece of this story that I almost left out, because when I first found it, I assumed I had misread the date. While I was researching agricultural extension archives for this video, I came across a 1943 wartime pamphlet distributed by the United States government itself, titled simply Wild Green Foods, part of a series of Victory Garden materials encouraging Americans to supplement rationed groceries with foraged vegetables. Lambsquarters was listed by name, described in the pamphlet as one of the most nutritious and abundant wild greens available across the entire country, with cooking instructions nearly identical to the ones I just walked you through. For a brief window during the Second World War, the same government that would later fund decades of herbicide research and weed eradication bulletins was actively telling American families to go pick this exact plant out of their yards because the country needed every available calorie. That contradiction sat with me for a long time. The same plant, praised in 1943 as a patriotic wartime food source, became, within 15 years, a target for chemical elimination once the post-war herbicide industry had something to sell, and a peacetime economy no longer needed citizens finding their own food for free. Necessity made the knowledge valuable enough to print and distribute nationwide. Prosperity made it inconvenient enough to erase. Nothing about the plant changed in those 15 years. Only what was profitable changed. I tracked down a reproduction of that wartime pamphlet through an agricultural history archive, and reading it next to the 1950s extension bulletins recommending eradication felt like reading two completely different countries describing the same plant. One treated it as a resource worth teaching an entire generation about. The other treated it as a problem worth spending chemical industry research budgets to eliminate. Both documents came from the same government, separated by little more than a decade, and the only thing standing between them was whether someone, somewhere, had found a way to profit from your dependence instead of your self-sufficiency. This is exactly the pattern Eleanor described to me as we stood at that fence line in Nebraska. She told me that in her research into Plains homestead records, the families who fared best during the genuinely catastrophic years, the drought years of the 1890s, the grasshopper plagues that stripped entire counties bare, were rarely the families with the most cultivated acreage. They were the families who understood the widest range of what their land could provide without cultivation at all. A family that only knew how to eat what they had planted, was entirely at the mercy of weather, pests, and luck. A family that also understood every edible plant already growing wild around their homestead had a second, almost invisible food system running in parallel the entire time, one that did not depend on a single growing season going well. That distinction between depending on what you planted and understanding what was already there is the entire reason I started digging into this topic in the first place. Modern food security advice almost always starts with the assumption that you need to grow something from scratch, that preparedness begins with seeds you purchase and rows you till. But pioneer families like Agnes operated from a completely different starting assumption. They assumed the land around them was already partially stocked, and their job was simply to learn how to recognize and harvest what was already growing, often before they ever picked up a hoe. If you want to take this further than your own backyard, the same principle extends to several other extremely common wild plants that most people mow, spray, or ignore without a second thought. Purslane, a low-growing succulent weed that appears in nearly every garden bed and sidewalk crack in the country during summer months, contains more omega-3 fatty acids than almost any other leafy plant, cultivated or wild, and was a documented staple in pioneer and indigenous diets across multiple regions. Dandelion, the plant and entire modern lawn care industry exists specifically to eliminate, has every part edible, the leaves, the flowers, and the root, with the root historically roasted and ground as a coffee substitute during periods when actual coffee was unavailable or unaffordable, including widely throughout the Civil War and again during the Great Depression. Both of these plants follow the exact same pattern as Lambsquarters: genuinely nutritious, genuinely abundant, and genuinely erased from common knowledge, specifically during the decades when chemical lawn and agricultural industries needed Americans to see them as problems rather than resources. I am not telling you to abandon your garden or stop growing the vegetables you already plant every spring. What I am telling you is that the ground around you, the fence lines, the forgotten corners, the patches you have been pulling weeds from for years, may already be doing a portion of the work that you assume requires cultivated rows and purchased seed. Pioneer families did not see a contradiction between a planted garden and a foraged harvest. They saw a single food system with two complementary parts, and they used both because using only one was a risk no family on the frontier could afford to take. What strikes me most about this entire story is not just the plant itself, but what it represents. Every fence row in America, every cracked sidewalk, every neglected corner of a backyard is potentially holding a food source that fed real families through real hardship for generations, and most of us walk past it every single day without seeing it. We have been trained, deliberately and systematically, to see only the cultivated rows as food and everything else as a problem to remove. Agnes did not have that training. She had her grandmother's voice in her ear, telling her where to look when the wheat failed, and she passed that voice down the same way my own grandmother passed it down to me at her kitchen table. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge gets quietly pushed aside whenever it threatens something profitable, you already understand exactly why a plant capable of feeding a family with zero cost and zero cultivation effort spent 70 years being labeled nothing more than a weed to spray. I want to hear from you. Look in your own yard this week, along a fence line, in a forgotten corner of a garden bed, and tell me in the comments if you find it growing there already. I read every single comment, and your answers shape exactly which plant, which method, and which forgotten piece of pioneer knowledge I bring you next. If this is the kind of knowledge you want waiting for you before you ever need it, not after, the complete Clara Root Food Storage Bible walks through every plant, every preservation method, and every system I have covered on this channel, organized so you can build real food security starting this week, regardless of how much land you have. The link is in the description below. And subscribe, not for me, but for what comes next. Because in the next video, I am going to show you the root cellar method that let a Nebraska family store a winter's worth of vegetables without a single inch of refrigeration, and the exact reason that knowledge nearly disappeared along with this one.